2-sentence summary of each chapter that you read. So that'll be the same every what the text says. That is, if you take nothing else away from this study, that is the goal, that you know what the text says. And you will get better as you practice, right? None of us start off great at anything. Think about riding a bike, right? It took a lot of practice to get adept at doing that. So we're going to practice. I'm going to try to ignore my echo up there, okay? Okay, so the next step in this CIA is interpretation. And so this is more of what we'll be doing on days 2 through 5 in the homework. We're going to zoom in a little bit on some of the text, and we're going to ask not only what does it say, but what does it mean? And this is harder sometimes, right? Sometimes you have to sit with it and be comfortable with I don't know. So do that though. Leave space for God to speak to you. Read it again, and then sit and ask God to open your heart to what he's trying to say to you. Be willing to come and discuss your questions and your thoughts with small group. It's okay if it's the wrong answer. That's how we learn. We want to sharpen each other. And so if you don't try, if you're not willing to put yourself out there, then it's harder to learn and to grow from that. So just know that this is a safe place. We're all going to muddle through it. If you remember from last time, I will be the first to admit when I don't know something or it's not clear. We're not going to know every single thing, right? But that's the beauty of coming together to study. Some other tools you can use in this part of it, the interpretation part of it, is cross-referencing. So noticing where that phrase or that word might be used in other parts of the Bible, or the dictionary can be really helpful because, let's be honest, sometimes it's like, well, I've heard that word, but I'm not quite sure what exactly it means. So notice that I didn't say commentaries, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But for now, try to stick to the text and what it says, and ask God to help you understand what it means. Our final step is application. Now, this is the step that we all kind of want to rush to, right? This is where we focus a lot on, well, how does this change me? How does this impact my life? Which is not a terrible question, but we have to break the pattern of rushing through comprehension and interpretation to get to application. You may notice that when James preaches on Sunday, he spends a lot of time in the text and helping us understand the context and what it's saying and what it means, especially in that time period or things like that. Is there application? Absolutely. There should be. But we cannot have proper application if we don't understand what the text is saying and what it means. So let's really try to do a good job of focusing on the comprehension and interpretation, and know that the application will come because that's what God's promised us, right? His word will change us for sure, but we have to understand it and make sure that we're reading it with careful eyes so that we're not pulling something out that shouldn't be there. My hope is, as we discuss in small group, that some of the questions you may have will get answered through other people's understanding of the text, right? And whatever doesn't get answered, it's my responsibility during the teaching time to then try to answer those questions as well. I will not be able to answer all of those questions, right? And I will say to you, I don't know, or the text isn't very clear, but here is some thought on what this could mean. But I never want to pass something off as biblical truth that isn't. That is my opinion or my idea. And I don't want you to take it away and think that this is what the Bible actually says. That's why it's so important that you read the text, you do the homework, you discuss it in small group, and then we come together for teaching. Because my teaching time, as I mentioned last time, really is commentary, right? Of course, we'll be reading the verses, but then my thoughts on those verses that I've gathered from other amazing teachers and scholars are commentary. So that's what I want you to treat it as, not as what the truth is of the Bible, okay? Like hold the Bible up here and me or any teacher down here, okay? All right, so back to commentaries. Jen asks, and I will echo this request, that you refrain from using commentaries until you've done the homework, been to small group, and been through the teaching time. Commentaries are not bad. They're wonderful. And any teacher worth his or her salt goes to the commentaries because it's important for us to learn on the backs of scholars who have spent many more years studying something than I have, right? So I will use commentaries to prepare my teaching time. Jen Wilkin uses commentaries to prepare her teaching time. James uses commentaries, but not until after we've read and sat with the text. Okay? So be comfortable with the, I don't know. Be okay to sit there. It's so hard because it's so easy to Google, right? To look up an answer. It's so easy to turn to commentaries. We have access to so much now. But if we run immediately to commentaries and we focus only on application, then we start to value the people who say something about the Bible more than the Bible itself. And that is the last thing that I would want to happen here. I want you guys to come away with a hunger for God's word and to realize that that is the most important thing, not what somebody has to say about the Bible. Doing this process of comprehension, interpretation, and application also helps guard us against false teaching, right? Because false teachers rely on the fact that you don't know what the text says. And then they can twist it and distort it. But if you have done the work, you will not be susceptible to that false teaching, no matter how charismatic or convincing that person is. Okay, so those are the reasons why we want to make sure we understand the text. I would encourage you to read the foreword that Jen Wilkin writes in her book, if you haven't already. She just really talks even more about her process and kind of how to go about using this study. Another phrase that she uses, and we used last time, is this idea of reading the envelope. Basically, if we were to get a nice handwritten letter, we wouldn't just rip it open without looking at the envelope and just jump to page 3, paragraph 2, and start reading, right? We would look at the envelope. We would see who the return address is from. We would see when it was sent. We would start at the beginning and read on, right? So that's what we want to do when we approach a book of the Bible as well. We want to answer some key questions. So on page 14 and 15, you're going to see some of those questions. And they, spoiler alert, are going to be pretty much the same answers as what we answered last time we did Genesis, because we're still in Genesis. So I'll focus a little bit more on this second part of Genesis, but really the envelope is going to stay very similar. Okay, so the first question: who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. Spoiler alert, right? We already talked about it. So who was Moses? Well, probably nobody looms larger in Israel's history than Moses, okay? He was Israel's deliverer. He delivered them out of Egypt. He was the lawgiver. He brought the law down from Mount Sinai. He was a prophet. He was a judge. He was obviously an author. He is attributed with writing the first 5 books of the Old Testament, known as the Pentateuch or the Torah. He is the spiritual father to the nation of Israel. So question number 2, when was Genesis written? It was written, it's believed, during the 40 years that Israel wandered in the wilderness after being delivered out of Egypt. So sometime between 1600 BC and 1400 BC. so roughly 3,500 years ago. Question 3, to whom was it written? Genesis is written to the generation of Israelites ready to enter the promised land under Joshua's leadership. If you're familiar with the story of Exodus, you know that when Moses leads the nation out of Egypt and they're wandering in the wilderness, he has a moment where he sins in his anger, and God says to him, "You will not lead these people into the promised land." So Moses knows that he will stand on the edge of what he's waited for 40 years. And he will send these people who are clearly precious to him into this pagan land without him. So we talked about it last time. His goal is to give them roots and to give them shoots. He will ground them in who they are and help them remember their history. Then he will point them to who they should be. They are headed into pagan territory, and they need to remember where they came from and to whom they belong to. That will be key. It's kind of like launching a child, right? Whether it's to college or the workplace. When you launch your child, you want them to remember who their people are, right? You want them to remember how we've lived the last 18 years. And you want to give them a few good rules or standards to live by as they go forward. That's basically what Moses is doing here. It's important to keep in mind as we read these books that they are written to a collection of people. This goes back to our desire to pull out application quickly without taking the time to understand what the context is. When we ask, how does it change me? And we try to take an individual application out of text that was written to the family of God, there's a good chance we're going to miss the mark. This doesn't mean that there isn't personal application. There absolutely is, but we just want to be careful. The personal application should be the product of how this applies to the family of God. Fourth question, in what style was this written? Genesis was written as a historical narrative. It is meant to be taken as fact. These were real people, real places, and real events that actually happened. The New Testament authors speak to these stories as factual. This doesn't mean there aren't any elements that may have an allegorical theme to them. In fact, we will pull out allegory as we see how Christ is represented in the text or how the text points to Christ. We will pull those out together. But that doesn't change the fact that these were real events, people, and places, okay? Genesis is divided neatly into two portions. Chapters 1 through 11, often referred to as the primeval history, covers 4 events. Okay, and remember, Moses is giving this narrative orally, so he uses a lot of memory tools to help his audience remember. So this is kind of a cool one. It was for me anyways. So the first part of Genesis, 1 through 11, covers 4 events: creation, fall, flood, and the Tower of Babel. Obviously, there's a lot more in there, but those are the main summary, okay? The next part of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, is referred to as the patriarchal history. And this portion covers 4 people, okay? So we've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So we see some nice symmetry there to kind of help us remember how Genesis is divided up and what it's covering. The patriarchal history covers 225 years, and they are deceptively simple stories that we may think we're pretty familiar with. However, as we progress, I hope you will have a much deeper understanding of the messages that Moses is trying to convey and how they speak to the rest of Scripture. Anytime you read a historical narrative, you know that the author had to kind of pick and choose what details to include. You cannot possibly include every detail. Moses chose what to include, obviously under God's divine leadership, right? But Moses chose what to include because he is trying to portray a specific message. He intends to convince us of something, and we should pay attention to that. We will see some pretty crazy stories in Genesis. They might be even hard to read, much less wrap our brain around. Things from deceit, polygamy, misogyny, incest, murder, human trafficking, rape, and more. Please keep in mind that Moses may not express horror at someone's behavior because he assumes you already know to be horrified. As you are reading these stories, ask yourself, what would Moses' assumption be about how I should read this? Don't assume that just because Moses was silent on something, it doesn't mean that God condones it. He is writing this with the assumption that you know that those things that I mentioned and whatever else is included that is wrong, and God does not approve of it, okay? Keep asking the question, what is the message Moses is trying to convey? All right, so our fifth question. What is the central theme of this book? Genesis means beginning. The book of Genesis is a book of beginnings, and there are several themes. It is the beginning of the world. It is the beginning of history. It is the beginning of sin. It is the beginning of redemption. It is the story of God's chosen people. The overarching question that Moses is answering, the thing the original audience wants to know, is how the people of God came to be in Egypt. And that is what we will discover in these 39 chapters. So before we dive into chapter 12, let's remember where we left off in chapter 11. We saw the dispersing of people in the Tower of Babel, right? Then in chapter 11, verse 10, we get some more genealogies, which now we all love and we all read carefully, right? Okay, and we trace the line of Shem in verse 10 all the way through verse 26. And then we see a name that we recognize, Abram. Abram is the one who will continue the righteous line. As we continue on in verses 27 through 32, we see that Abram's brother has a son named Lot, and Abram's brother dies. Okay, so Lot is Abram's nephew. His father dies, so that's why we end up seeing Lot with Abram as we move forward. We also meet Sarai, who is Abram's wife. Now, most of you know, but we switch names eventually in the narrative, right? So right now, we have Abram and Sarai. It will get changed to Abraham and Sarah. So I'm sure, mix them up when I'm talking, but we're talking about the same person. Okay, so we learn about Sarai that she is barren. She cannot have a child. So that's the scene set for us as we move into chapter 12. We have the story contract from all of mankind in the Tower of Babel, right? And then it contracts in, and now we're focusing on this one family, Abram's family. And that's what we will follow as we move forward, okay? So that's the introduction. That was the first week that I condensed down. Does anybody need a little bit of a stretch break before we move into the next week's discussion on chapters? It should be 12 through 16, but as I was writing my talk and I was getting done with 15, I was like, my brain is mush. So I cannot imagine how these ladies are drinking from a fire hydrant right now, like how they're feeling. So I went ahead and stopped at 15 to help save us some time, and I will pick up on 16 next week and I'll add it to our talk there. Because 16 is the story of Sarai and Hagar, and it's just too important of a story to rush through. So I want to give it the attention it deserves. Okay, so we're going to go through 12 through 15. We're going to cover 4 chapters next. So I'm going to take a drink. So if you want to flip past the first week's homework, you'll see a spot to take notes after that session, the week 2 session notes, if you want to take notes there. Page 32. Thank you, Carrie. All right. Come on in, Jasmine. It's a perfect timing. We just finished the introduction and we're jumping into second week, so you're good to go. So this week we are doing the talk first, and then we'll do small group. But that's a good point, because from going forward, we'll meet small group and we'll just meet in here first, and then we'll do the talk after that. So. Okay, so if you want to have your Bibles turned to chapter 12, that's where we're going to kind of start. I do want to talk a little bit about the homework. I talked about how the first day is going to almost always, I think, be a summary day. You're going to read all the chapters we're covering and you're going to summarize them. Every week, the last day of homework has one final wrap-up question, and it's the same one as we saw last time. It asks, what did you learn about God in this week of study? And in light of that, what does that tell you about you? So I know it's easy to skip over that question a lot of times. I'm totally guilty of it, okay? But it is a good question, because it really does help us summarize kind of everything that we've been thinking about and looking at with God that week. And it pulls our focus back to who is God. Who is he? What are some of his attributes? And so there is a list of attributes in the back of your book on pages 188 to 189. Obviously, it's not all inclusive, but it is a good place to kind of get started. So if you need a little bit of help to try to think of a word that you can't quite, come up with, that can be really helpful. So try not to skip it, as tempting as it can be, okay? So as we said before, the story of Genesis is narrowed down to Abram, and we see how he is part of the righteous line that traces back to Shem, Noah, and ultimately Seth, right? We will see in the rest of Genesis how that righteous line carries forward. So remember that Moses intends to answer the one big question for the original audience: how did Israel end up in Egypt? And we will see the beginning of that in these chapters. And we also get to see the covenant God made with Abram articulated for the first time. So turn to chapter 12, where we will pick up with the story of Abram. Genesis devotes 14 of the 39 chapters of the patriarchal history to Abraham. That's a high percentage, right? He is extremely important to our understanding of who the nation of Israel is, and correspondingly then, who we are as people of God who inherit the promise through Christ. So verses 1 through 3 of chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." I will be reading out of the ESV unless I note otherwise, just as a little side note. So in these opening statements, we get a lot of God saying, "I will." And if you had a chance to do the homework, we got to explore that a little bit in the homework. God is making it very clear right out of the gate who will be setting the agenda here. The Bible is a book about God. So now look at verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. Do you see that pattern there that goes all the way back to the creation account, the flood account, where God said, or the Lord said, and it was so. That's how we saw him create the world. That's what he did with Noah in building the ark. God says to do it, and it is so. So what we will see as we move into the lives and the stories of these people, that the "it was so" portion is now enacted by the people of God. God speaks the command, and the people of God act in obedience as response. Sometimes, hopefully. Hopefully more often than not, right? Okay, we'll see both sides. So, what does God ask Abram to do? Essentially, he tells him to leave everything he knows, everyone he knows, and go. Go where exactly? Well, that part's not quite so clear, right? He just says to go into the land that I will show you. If it were me, I think I'd want a little more detail, right? I have had to go. We've had to leave family and everything we know and move to a new place. But I knew where I was going, right? We already had the house set up. We had, all of those things. I cannot imagine just being told to leave everything behind and not even know where we're going. That would be incredibly difficult. In order to really understand this, we need to know a little bit more about Ur of the Chaldeans. This was an ancient city that was actually very advanced. They had stone houses and hot and cold running water. These people were educated, and it was a very modern city for its time. So Abram is called to leave this modern city where everything and everyone is familiar and it's very comfortable, and to go somewhere completely opposite. He is basically called to what would be a complete nightmare for me, a camping trip that never ends. I told you guys in our last study, my maiden name is Camp. I can count on one hand the number of times I've been camping. It is not my thing. But Hebrews 11:9 tells us that Abram spent the rest of his life living in tents. So that is what the rest of his life will look like. Then we see this amazing promise that he will have a great nation, that God will make his name great and bless those who bless him and curse those who dishonor him. Why do you think God took Abram out of the familiar? What lesson can be learned from that? Have you ever faced something similar where God pulls you out of everything you know? It seems that the only way Abram is going to learn total reliance on God, who is worthy of total reliance, is to be placed in circumstances where that is the only option. I know I've seen that in my own life, and I bet that many of you can think of examples in yours as well. So we see God's faithfulness in extracting him out of the familiar. It probably doesn't feel like that at the time, though, right? But that is God's faithfulness because he cares more about our hearts. He cares more about Abram's heart than he does with our comfort. In the promise that all nations of the earth will be blessed through him, we see an articulation of the future promise of Christ. This isn't the first place we've seen this, though, right? Think back to Genesis 3:15 when God talks to the serpent. And he tells the serpent that through the seed of the woman will come the one that crushes the serpent's head. So when God says this to Abram, that through him all future generations will be blessed, he is pulling forward that promise and saying, the seed is going to come through you, Abram. Verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. Don't rush past the significance of that. We don't hear Abram hesitate. We hear him respond immediately in obedience. So picking back up again. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Perk your ears up every time you hear mention of the Canaanites, and then think back to who Moses is talking to and what they're about to do, okay? So the Canaanites are in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. That would be very interesting to the original audience, right? So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. Excuse me. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward Negeb. So as we see Abram entering into the land of Canaan, what is he doing? He's building altars. He's establishing places of worship for the one true God. The Oak of Moreh is significant because the Canaanites, who were pagans, used these oaks as places of worship for their pagan gods. So Abram is not only building an altar to the one true God, but he's doing it in the very place that pagan practices had occurred. Okay, and like I said while we were reading it, let's pay attention every time we hear Canaanites. And remember Moses' original audience. They're getting ready to go in and take the land of Canaan by conquest. Are they super excited to be doing this? No, they're terrified. They're terrified, right? Moses is building their resolve. He's building their courage. And even more, he's building their trust in a God who calls us out into an uncertainty for the purpose of demonstrating his trustworthiness. Okay, so this is all intentional, the way Moses builds this narrative. Also notice that God says, "To your offspring I will give this land." Paul actually quotes that and expands on it in Galatians. Galatians 3:16 says, "Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring." It does not say, "and offsprings," referring to many, but referring to one, "and to your offspring," who is Christ. So Paul